Good morning, this is Tractorbeam, and today I'm going to be talking about my problem with the Canon 80D. The too long didn't read is that if you take yourself seriously as a time-lapse photographer, you're going to have to buy a brand new camera every 56 days. In the camera, there's two ways that you can make a time-lapse. You can use photography mode or movie mode, and each one has their own problems. And if you want to take the best possible time-lapses, you have to use the photography intervalometer. This is a device that's just going to take one picture every however long that you want to wait. Then you take those pictures and you put it into a program like Adobe Premiere and you use that to turn it into a movie. So keep in mind this is the advanced version. The problem with this is you're going to see hard exposure steps. What that means is, especially for a sunrise, which is something that I like to take time lapses of, as it gets brighter outside, the camera is going to automatically adjust the exposure to compensate for that, but it's going to do it in big jumps. Now, as an alternative, you can do it manually, but even if you're doing it manually, the jumps are just too big. You're going to see them. They're going to be obvious. So the way that you solve that is you have to get a program called Lightroom and then LRTimelapse. Lightroom is a program by Adobe for adjusting photographs. LRTimelapse is a program that will adjust a series of photographs so that they all have a similar exposure. Lightroom costs $120 a year. LRTimelapse costs $100 once. So that means in order to make your first time-lapse using the photography mode, you're going to have to spend $220. If you want to take one picture every few seconds, this is the way to do it. There is one big problem with doing it this way though, and that is shutter wear. So listen closely to the camera. That's the shutter firing. As long as the camera is in photograph mode, every single time that it takes a shot, the shutter is going to actuate. This is a physical mechanism with moving parts that's going to eventually wear out. The slow-mo guys made a great video about it. If you're interested in learning more about it, you can watch that here. So here's the problem. The Canon 80D is rated for 100,000 shutter actuations. After you take 100,000 photographs, the Canon 80D is past its life expectancy. Now that doesn't mean that it's going to break, but it could happen anytime. As you take more and more photographs, the shutter will wear out, it will lose accuracy, and eventually it will break. So if you're really into time lapses, we're going to say that you're going to take a 1 hour time lapse, and that's one shot every 2 seconds. In total, that's 1,800 shots. If you take that 1 hour time lapse of the sunrise every day, then you can expect this camera to reach its 100,000 limit in 56 days. So if you've had the camera for 2.5 months and you've been using the time lapse feature every day, and then something happens to the camera, so you send it into Canon, they're going to send it back with a message like this.
Sorry that we are unable to blah 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 blah. The service life on this model has expired.
Basically, they're going to refuse to service it. You can pay them to service it, but it's going to be quite expensive. You take it to a shop, they're going to charge you $400, so you're basically better off just buying a new camera. So a new camera every 2 months if you like taking time lapses. There is another option which does not use the shutter, and that's movie mode. So the movie mode has its own time-lapse function. It's called time-lapse mode, and it's only in 1080p. Now for me, that's fine. It's not ideal. Obviously, a time-lapse is going to be very visual, but it's okay. It'll get the job done. The problem that comes up is that it does not correct the exposure automatically. You set the exposure at the beginning, and it keeps it the entire time. So what that means is that if it's getting brighter or darker throughout the time-lapse, by the end of the time-lapse, it's going to be either overexposed or underexposed, or you're going to have to predict the exposure when you want it to end and set it to that. That makes recording something like a sunrise almost impossible. If you start recording at 6 o'clock, you have to take into account things like clouds, where the sun is going to be up behind it, whether or not clouds are going to move in front of it, the time of year, and probably a bunch of things that I don't even fully understand yet. I've been taking a lot of time lapses trying to get this just right, and it's very difficult to make it right. So if you put it in manual mode, meaning you set the exposure yourself, you can set it the way that you want it. If you take notes, then you can set it the way that you think it's going to turn out. Hopefully it will turn out that way. Or you can try automatic mode. You would think automatic mode, it's going to set the exposure automatically throughout, but it doesn't. In automatic mode, it meters the exposure at the very beginning. So the minute that you hit the button for it to start taking the time lapse, that's when it sets the exposure. Then it keeps those settings throughout the time lapse. So if you start out and it's night and you get a nice night shot, the minute the sun starts coming up, it's going to blow out. So automatic mode doesn't work. So if you're not using automatic mode and you put it in manual mode, let's say that it starts getting brighter than you predicted. The problem here is that you cannot adjust it while it's taking a time lapse. Every button except for the stop button does not function while it's taking a time lapse. So if you want to adjust something, you're going to have to stop the time lapse, make the adjustment, and then start another time lapse. And here's another thing. If you're not sure, like if you don't know exactly where the exposure is at, there's no button where you can even preview where the exposure is at. You can't hit a button and see what it looks like. The only way you can see what it looks like is, again, to stop the time lapse, look at where it's at, adjust it, and then start a new time lapse. And keep in mind, when you're doing this, if you bump the camera even a little bit, that's going to show up in the time lapse too, because it's going to be pointed in one direction, then it's going to be pointed in another direction. Those little jumps, people will notice it. Or at least I'll notice it. So if you're being tedious and you're checking everything every couple of minutes and you get everything just the way that you want it, then you can take multiple videos, put it in Adobe Premiere, and then make your video. And keep in mind, this is supposed to be the easy mode, right? This is the camera takes a time lapse and makes a movie. But even in easy mode, you have to put that thing in a program to make your time lapse. So that leaves us with one good option, and that's to record an entire 1 hour video. So that's 30 frames per second or 24 frames per second or whatever you want to use. And then in Adobe Premiere, shrink that down in time. It's going to properly adjust its exposure over time. And plus you're going to have a few other creative abilities, like you're going to be able to slow down and speed up things, so if something interesting happens, you can slow it down on that and then speed it back up. But the problem here is that those are going to take up a lot of space. It's the difference between a 120 megabyte file and a 12 gigabyte file. And also keep in mind it's going to use more power because the screen is going to be on the entire time, and if it's a very hot day, it's also going to be possible that it's going to overheat. This camera doesn't really have a problem with overheating, but it does say in the manual that if you leave the screen on for too long, it might overheat, especially if it's on a hot day. And if it does overheat, it's going to automatically shut off. And the other problem with this is that while the camera is recording continuously, it can only record for a total of 30 minutes at a time. And the reason for that is because the European Union put a 5 to 12% import tax on all video cameras. So most cameras can also record video, so what it is you have to have a camera that records for less than 30 minutes in order to still be classified as a photography camera. And even though this is a rule by the European Union, it affects every single Canon 80D. It doesn't matter where you buy it, 30 minutes max. And that's not just Canon, that's every single manufacturer. They all do that. Kind of makes you think that Brexit was a good idea. But if you think about it, that just makes it easier for Canon to sell things like the C100. So if you're using this method of recording a time lapse or recording a full video, you're going to have to be at that camera at the 30-minute mark to start recording again. And if something important is happening then, or even if you bump the camera a little bit, you ruin the whole shot. So let's compare this to a GoPro Hero 4 Silver. GoPro Hero 5 is out now. That means that this is an older generation and it's also an inferior model. There's the black and the silver, and if you want to learn more about those, you can watch this video I made here about the GoPro Hero 4 Silver versus the black. But right out of the box, this inferior, older model gets superior sunrise time lapses. I know that if I set this up and I point it at the sunrise, it's not going to get the absolute best shot, but it is going to get the shot that I want. It's going to have a nice, even exposure adjustment the entire time. It's going to be in 4K, and it's going to be usable. Now, the Canon, just because of the lens type, you're going to have more control over the field of view. You're going to have more control over the focus, but I guarantee that the GoPro footage is going to be usable. The Canon, I've only got a small percentage chance. So let's talk about the 4K for a minute. Comparing the GoPro Hero 4 Silver to the black is a stronger model because it can record 4K at 30 frames per second. The reason it's able to do that is because it has a stronger encoding processor than the silver. The black can record 60 megabits per second, so that's a 4K picture 30 times a second. So the silver records 1080p at 30 frames per second. But even though in standard movie mode it records at 1080p, it can still record 4K time lapses. And the reason it can do that is because the megabit requirement is much lower. This only has to record one shot every 2 seconds. So if each shot is 5 megabytes in size and it takes one shot every 2 seconds, that's 2.5 megabytes per second. That's very easy even for a low-end processor. The Canon 80D has a 24 megapixel sensor, so that's 6,000 pixels by 4,000, or 6K depending on how you want to determine that. It has a Digic 6 processor. That is considerably better than the GoPro Hero 4 Black. That means that this camera has the hardware to make a 6K time-lapse using video mode. If the average photograph is 8 megabytes and it takes one shot every 2 seconds, they would have to encode 4 megabytes per second. It is completely capable of doing that. And this is the part that really bothers me. Canon 80D has a better processor, it has a better sensor, it has a better lens than the GoPro Hero 4 Silver, and yet a lesser model of a previous generation camera at a quarter of the price is capable of getting the shot where the Canon 80D is not. And it's all because of software. So that's a thing that you only had to do once. You might have to make a lens 1,000 or even thousands of times, and every time you make that lens you have to get it right. But the software you only have to make once. You just get the right team, they put it together, and you copy and paste it to every single camera. And that team could have made the photography mode use the shutter optionally. We know it's possible because of movie mode, where it doesn't use the shutter. In movie mode, it just tells the sensor to start absorbing light and then stop absorbing light on a timer, so you can get a different effect. So effectively, you have a shutter speed adjustment without any moving parts. A physical shutter is better, it's more accurate, but you don't need that if you're making a time lapse. They could have made it so that if you're in movie mode, you could adjust the settings on the fly. So you could hit a button on the back, it would show you what it's actually recording, and it would allow you to manually adjust the exposure. They could have made it so that if you put in automatic movie time lapse mode, it would automatically adjust the exposure. This is something that GoPro was able to figure out. They could have allowed the camera to shoot 6K in movie time lapse. which made me think, okay, maybe there's a firmware update. So I went to the website, the Canon 80D website, to see if there's a firmware update. There's no firmware update. And if you look at the forums, the people that are talking about Canon firmware updates say that they don't put out firmware updates very often, if at all. So I've been thinking a lot about why the camera is gimped like this, and I can only come up with 3 good reasons as to why this is a thing. Either A, they didn't know they could do it, which to me says incompetence. If you don't know that you can automatically expose, that's incompetence. They didn't know how to do it, which again, that's incompetence. If GoPro can do it, they should be able to do it. Or because they want you to buy a more expensive camera. So in other words, they would have intentionally gimped the software on the camera in order to force you to spend a couple $1,000s more to get what you actually want. Now my guess is that it's a third one, but I can't confirm that because I don't have a Canon 5D or a 1D. But if there is somebody out there that has one of those cameras, and if you could tell me if there is a movie encoding time-lapse feature that uses the full sensor and auto exposes, I would very much like to know, because that would tell me whether or not Canon is either incompetent or if they just think the customers are stupid. So that brings me back to the beginning. If you plan on buying a Canon 80D for the intention of making professional level time lapses, you'd better be willing to buy another one every 56 days.